Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Great Unread Books podcast. As we foreshadowed in the last episode, which was on a very, very lighthearted topic, Thomas Piketty. It's Thomas Piketty, right?
Well, we didn't say that in the last one, but you're just ruining everything we did in the last one. Alex, you can't just do that. You can't let me say Thomas for an entire episode and then wait to the next episode to be like Thomas.
It should be Thomas
Piketty Capital. But that's fine. You really left me stranded. I feel terrible.
Oh, no. Well, we spent a lot of time speaking, about the pronunciation of his last name, but we didn't really get to his first name. But, great authors, we focus mostly on their last name, which I think is
that's a sign of it. If you've got a first name in there, you haven't really hit the canon.
We're really thrilled to welcome our audience back. I'm sure the audience is bigger for the second episode than it was for the first. We got some great feedback from some listeners of the first episode, and we're going to do our best to iterate and improve as we go along. Isn't that right, Robin?
Alex,
Yeah.
It's so important. When I get out of the bed every morning, I'm thinking, what about our audience, our tens of listeners? We can't leave them waiting. And honestly, we've kept them waiting too long. There's not much time in this world to either read books or listen to podcasts about books. We're going to deliver great value in this episode. Great value is coming, guys.
Great value for money, especially if you subscribe to Spotify for $0 per month. It's a great deal. So without further ado, we have an incredible book in front of us today. It's more than 1,200 pages. It's a brick of a book that has sat on more than 1 million bookshelves for more than 6 decades since it was published. And that 1 million is not hyperbolic. This book sold not only in its first edition, but in hardback and paperback many editions since it was first published. And that is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, published in 1960, just 15 years. So put yourself in the 15 years after the conclusion of the Second World War, and this book was published.
So that would be, for us, that would be 2000 and...
Well, which event are
11.
we comparing? After what world event, though? Exactly. It would be, but again, a war that was far more impactful to everyday Brits or Americans than the Iraq War, sadly. But yeah, so right in the aftermath of the Second World War, and I just wanted to start with a little quote to get the creative juices flowing, and just to let you know kind of the gravity of the issues that this book takes on. Quote, Adolf Hitler is probably the last of the great adventurer conquerors in the tradition of Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon, and the Third Reich the last of the empires which set out on the path taken earlier by France, Rome, and Macedonia. The curtain was rung down on that phase of history, at least, by the sudden invention of the hydrogen bomb, of the ballistic missile, and of rockets that can be aimed to hit the moon. That's just right. That's like 7 pages into this incredibly thick book, and it really sets the tone for the bravery and the boldness of the author, taking on some huge topics in the course of this.
I mean, that's
book.
The kind of thing you would say for page 1200, and he's dropping bombs, I guess, in the spirit of the Luftwaffe, in the spirit of Bomber Harris.
In his preface. So, we're gonna treat that as a little bit of a cliffhanger, and we're gonna take a step back, because Robin, this podcast is ultimately about the activity of acquiring new books at an unsustainable rate and only reading a portion of them. So before we dive into The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, have you acquired any books in the last week or two since we last spoke?
Alex, it's been a tough week. It is a heroin addict in a poppy field month in Madrid. It is the Feria del Libro, which is a month of booksellers.
Oh my goodness.
Right by the Retiro right now, there is a street full of booksellers. Not to brag, but a book I've contributed to is being sold, and some of my co-authors were signing on it. So I went down to support them and offered to sign. And then, of course, I got Borges. And I think this quote right here is kind of great, which is, they really know how to market books in Spain. I got this literally because this yellow thing caught my eye, the little promotional thing.
Yeah, that's great, actually.
And so it says, out of the labyrinth, we leave reading, which I think is a great statement. And it has a quote, which is, one is not defined, or one is not what one is according to what one writes, but by what one reads.
I love that.
But he's kind of an enemy of the podcast. It should be, and also what one has started to read and given up on.
Exactly. I don't want to give too much legitimacy to the view that you need to read it all.
And Alex, this is something for people on the video.
The sentiment.
But this little thing is so exciting. You know what this actually is?
Is it a map?
A poster of portraits. So I can put up a
And a great
a
photo.
pinup of this. Can you imagine just putting that up right by my wall? And imagine
listeners,
that,
for listeners of the audio only podcast, it's a photo of Borges, which is about life size, and maybe slightly smaller. And Maria is going to love it.
Listen, it's one of those things that can just really, you put a book on the nightstand, but if you want to spice things up, a photo of Borges by your bed is just going to make it muy picante, as we would say in Spanish. That means
Make sure
very
you
spicy.
What?
Look, my chances of reading these, I'm going to put at 2 to 3% maximum.
No, that's excellent, and I applaud you for that ratio. I think you get a little taste of Borges, and that's all you need. So on my side, yeah, I think one's worth mentioning. It's got a great title, Long Live the Post Horn, which takes a few minutes to figure out what it actually means. But the title comes from a Kierkegaard work, actually. And it's about the value, it's about the nostalgia, really, of the postal service. And the post horn that the buglers used to play when they made their rounds to make sure that people knew that the postal service was coming through. And Robin, fasten your seatbelt. It's about the third postal reform directive of the European Commission and the impact on the local postal service in rural Norway.
When?
And so,
in what time period?
Present day.
What?
But actually, so now that I make a joke, you would actually really like it because it's about a PR consultancy advising the Norwegian Postal Union on how to resist implementation of the directive, and it's actually pretty darn impressive, and it's by a fantastic Norwegian author who I didn't know before, Vigdis Hjorth.
Okay.
And she's highly regarded, and her work is increasingly being translated into English because my Norwegian is not as good as your Spanish. So I'll send it over. I'll send it your way when I've finished it.
Thanks, Alex. That is great. I got to say, I was about to sound very knowledgeable, being like, like turn in taxis, like the pension reader would know about the postal horn, because we have the little symbol of the postal horn, and we all know that from reading Thomas Pynchon and all this sort of stuff. But I think that done
was
with.
Nice. But that
What's
was
really
nice.
cool now is out with the German postal family of the 18th century, in with Norwegian postal reform of 2020, because in this technologically advanced world,
exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing.
But we should, and actually, I forgot where I even stumbled across it. It was referenced as like one of the better novels about bureaucracy that exists, and it's a tough topic to take on. But I have to say, in all seriousness, it's a page turner. They introduced the topic of ghost letters, which are letters written without discernible addresses, and sort of how the Postal Service deals with those beautiful
Listen,
things.
I'm pretty intrigued. I hope you didn't finish it so we can do it on the podcast later.
I'll try my best not to finish it so we can feature it on the episode. That's going to be tough. It's paradoxical in this case. Well, that's fun. That's also, I think that helps to give our listeners some ideas too. Anything worth quickly mentioning in the category of finished books? Because this podcast is
Fallen
not really
Comrades.
about. Okay.
I finished A Scanty Plot of Ground, which is an anthology of sonnets. Which it's very rare that I ever finish any anthology of poems. For me, anthologies are there to be dipped in and out of, and
totally agree.
That's it. But I honestly found this a riveting read. It is just an anthology of about 140 sonnets, organized by author A to Z, or A to Z, as you would say, Alex. Indeed. I don't want to be prejudiced. I want you to make sure that you understand me completely. And I will say it was great. I think the sonnet form, I hadn't realized how varied it could be. And to see these modern authors next to authors that I was more familiar with was mind-blowing, honestly.
Incredible.
The sonnet is such a TikTokable form. It takes about 90 seconds to read one. You kind of want to read it again. You kind of want to read it again. And then you're done, and it sticks with you. I just loved it, to be honest. It just carried me along. It was such an easy read.
Incredible. Robin. And you're
Alex,
reading
what about you?
widely.
What do we have to lay to rest?
I read a much more straightforward but pretty good book called The Descent by a Moscow correspondent named Mark Bennett from the UK originally, like you, Robin. Oh. And he basically, Mark, you must know. He moved to Moscow in the 90s, and he was there until 2022, like many correspondents, and then he had to leave. And it wasn't entirely surprising, but it was well written.
Well, I was about to say, so he's kind of, he's in that David Remnick generation as well, kind of optimistic Russianists who all come over in the 90s, expecting one thing and getting quite the opposite over 10 to 15 years.
Exactly right. And Remnick was savvy enough to get out pretty quickly and establish himself as something more than a, sort of a trauma reporter. But not everyone was as lucky. So, but worth reading. Worth reading. Maybe we switch. What do you think, Robin? Back to the rise and fall of the Third Reich.
Listen, it's always a good time to discuss William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's never not Shirer time or Shirer time. I'm always saying it's Shirer time and halftime Shirer o'clock.
So basically, just to set a little bit of context. So Shirer is, a journalist by training and a very prominent one at that. He was in Germany as of 1934, so pretty early in the story as it relates to the rise of Hitler. He was born around the turn of the century in the Midwest in the U.S. and was a foreign correspondent in India and other spots before he landed in Germany. And then he was hired 37, I believe, by none other than Edward R. Murrow. So some pretty impressive company he was keeping. Yeah,
He's associated with the biggies.
So as we mentioned at the top, the book that he ended up writing about 15 years after the end of the war was a huge book, about 1,200 pages in 6 aptly called books. So these chapters are about 200 pages apiece. The Rise of Hitler, The Triumph and Consolidation, The Road to War, then we get to the war, beginning of the end, and then the very end. I think that the structure is reflective of the very straightforward approach that he was taking. He wanted to document what happened, who the key players were, what they were thinking. He wants to leave as little ambiguity as possible as to what this meant for Germany, but also for the rest of the world.
I mean, I think that's what is the appeal of it. I think that it is a book that is determined just to process what happened over 10 years and just go over events. And as I understand it, one of the great pieces of luck that historians had is that the Russians and the Allied armies were able to get to the documents before the Nazis could destroy them all. So the Nuremberg trials just became this incredibly rich source. And he got to these things and just decided to process them. And in a way that I think is just kind of logical. It is just, how did they get so far? And then how did they lose it all? Which is just a classic structure for a history.
And so, Robin, it sounds like you've read a little bit of this book. Is that a fair conclusion?
I'm up to 30%. This is a Kindle read, so I can tell you exactly when I bought it, and I can tell you exactly when I gave it up.
That's arguably at the higher end of the percentage we're allowing in this series.
As we already discussed in our last thing, the unfair thing is that that's actually sort of hundreds of pages. And yet, if I was to have the bookmark in the book and it was on a shelf, someone would be like, well, I guess Robin didn't read much of that book, which is why this book should be bound into its 6 constituent books.
I agree. And that's going to be...
if you re-release it.
And I think that's going to be a recurring piece of advice for publishers and authors alike. If you publish this in 6 volumes of the Second World War...
Everyone is doing the subscription model. Folks,
Indeed.
Come on. Do a subscription model. I want to just subscribe to this book. Send me, a 200-page book every 2 months, and then I'll get through those.
Brilliant. So, and I think, sorry, just as an aside, I think the publishers are going to come to really appreciate the advice we dole out on this.
I really am concerned about them, and I could be patenting these ideas, but I'm going to give it to them for free because I'm making plenty of money elsewhere. But book publishers, they're losing money hand over fist, and I just want to help out my buds in the Random Houses, in the Simons. I want to help out Simon and Schuster, just Incredible. Like that. I don't want to even pick between them.
So tell me, Robin, I think about 15 years ago you came across this book. Is that right?
The reason why I picked it up is twofold. I'm a huge fan of Ron Rosenbaum, who is this really weird nonfiction writer, and the range of things he's covered is really crazy in the sense that he will cover for Esquire the phone freaks, who are the people who hack the AT&T Bell system, which is basically the beginning of hacker culture and which inspires Steve Jobs himself to get into computers. So he can take that. Cool. He wrote a very good book on editors of Shakespeare, which he calls the Shakespeare's Wars, which is all the little scholarly battles over Shakespeare.
That's
and kind of very sort of small stakes in their own way, but very high stakes because it's Shakespeare. And then he did a book called Explaining Hitler, which is literally what it says on the tin, which is not about his explanation for Hitler, but how everyone who tries to explain what made Hitler Hitler ends up frustrated and sad. And so I just think that's a tremendous book. I absolutely love it. And he wrote an introduction to this William Shirer book because he is a huge fan of the German journalists who stood up to Hitler. And some Munich newspaper and things like that. And there's a legendary story of some Munich journalist who had the scoop on Hitler that was going to destroy him. But then the stormtroopers came in and destroyed literally their printing presses. We don't know what the scoop was. And then they killed the guy and sent his glasses to life.
We still don't know what the scoop was.
We don't, because they destroyed it. It's probably something to do with Hitler's genealogy. And so he wrote an introduction to the reissue of this book where he said, it might seem outdated, but it's just a great literary artifact.
Fantastic.
Which sort of gives you this sense day by day, week by week, that people had a choice at every moment. And you just get this sort of creeping sense of dread on the one hand and excitement on the other as the plans of the Nazis just keep on working out for them. And all of their opponents keep on stepping on rakes just week by week.
Robin, that was a beautiful scene setter. Do you recommend the introduction itself, the Rosenbaum introduction? I mean, considering this is a podcast about how to
if you don't want to read this book, read the
volumes.
Introduction, and then you can talk about this book forever. It is great. It's all you need to do. So, folks, I think you can find it at the Smithsonian magazine. Rush out and just get to that. Save yourself 1,200 pages.
That's a very accessible recommendation, the Smithsonian magazine. I love it.
You're not a subscriber, Alex?
Yeah, no, I'm not, but maybe I should add it to my list of unread magazines every month. So you've already hinted at this, but I think you had some reasons to acquire this book because you like the genre of history.
This is a genre. This is my go-to genre when I'm troubled, Alex, when I can't sleep. My go-to genre is going to be, for insomnia, is a nice, long history. It's got to have personalities. It's got to have events. It's got to be about a familiar kind of sequence of events. It's kind of like a true crime Netflix series. There's some mystery to it, but you kind of know what Jeffrey Dahmer did in the end.
Yeah, the trajectory.
There's no spoilers, really. But you just want to have like 10, 15 people and you follow them through time and you get really attached to them. When I'm down and I can't sleep, these are the histories I reach out to. And I would have seen this on the Kindle. The story was that I'd got laid off from Google. I'd moved to Spain to try and set up my consultancy, see what my next chapter was. Obviously, a lot of thoughts in my mind. And this would have appeared at some point. I bet I did this at 10 p.m. Yeah. And I was like, how am I just going to calm myself down and stop my head from spinning? And this was the RX. This was the medicine. It was just exactly what I needed. According to my reading history, I was solidly at it sort of almost every night for like 3 months. And then the medication worked. The things in the consultancy were gelling. And all of a sudden, I just needed to reduce my Shirer dosage.
You don't necessarily need to finish the book. That's really kind of the most difficult hump to get over. The first few weeks are so invigorating, and then tapers off.
Listen, it's for me. There's nothing more exciting, and actually that quote that you just did, like a good preface is just like a fantastic. You can't believe how well this first night has gone. The date has been terrific.
Yeah,
and then the first chapters, you're waking up for breakfast. You're like, I want to stay with you forever. But at a certain point, like there's always going to be a moment like, am I going to be spending the rest of my life with this book? And that's the question.
Exactly. The marginal value of pages 700 to 900 is far less than pages X to XX.
And I think also in this case, where I ended was with the invasion of Austria.
When it gets extremely war-y and we're talking troop numbers and fronts, it becomes a little bit burdensome to
look.
I
know that you're more of a manly man than me, but I don't like sports, and I think war is the sports of history. It's stuff that's just random chaos, but a lot of commentators being like, "Oh, that was a fantastic move by X," and you're like, "I don't see any order in this." What's much more real to me is ideas, debates, and arguments, and however my brain is wired.
Yep,
I'm much more interested in what leads people to war and how people recover from war, and then the war itself, I skip it.
We're the same in this, the battle of ideas, the origin of ideas.
It's thrilling.
That stuff is wild.
Thrilling.
The only exception for me is I am interested in trench foot, as a concept. I think when trench foot appears in the book, I get excited just because that's just proof that I couldn't handle even one day on the battlefield.
As in, like, you like it when something happens and then cholera breaks out. Is that the sort of thing you like?
That sort of thing, exactly. Or just the concept of the quartermaster, where an individual and a team had to provision an entire army as they bivouac. That verb is a great one.
Alex, yeah. You've triggered something in me, which is that I was like, well, maybe I do like war a little bit more when I was, something about Napoleon was cropping up. And he was like, it's all about the supply lines.
That sort of thing.
And then all of a sudden I was like, well, that's actually kind of interesting. That is true. You've got to do a lot of organization to get the stuff to the front.
It's pretty consistent when these armies overextend and they don't have their supply lines sorted. That's when they collapse. So those sorts of things are pretty interesting, but that's
literally
like the
most nerdy parts of it. Exactly. We are just the nightmare. We're there with all the alpha males, and they've just read American Sniper, and they're all pumped. And we're just sitting there going, did you know how the bullets actually got there? Interesting story, though. The American military had to adapt to a whole new kind of way because the bullets were much heavier than they were before. So fascinatingly, they had to set up a whole new base and negotiate diplomatically for this because the materiel was so hard to get.
I
would read that book. Material trench
with
foot.
an E. With an E.
E.
That's a reliable clickbait for me. Yeah. Well, okay. So, Robin, I think if we had to, this is unfair to Shirer, but if we had to reduce down to one topic that this book is kind of known for and also controversial for, it's this Sonderweg thesis. Unique path, special path is what it means. And this is, we're not going to get to the bottom of this in the podcast today. Disclaimer. This is the notion that it was more or less inevitable that there would be at least a rise of a Hitler-like figure in Germany. Everything from Luther to Bismarck to Hitler was sort of a preordained path. And this is sort of the German experience, preordained. I think Shirer felt quite confidently about this, but obviously actually I've had history professors who have sort of stopped the conversation in its tracks when we talk about contingency or inevitability in history, because it is extremely interesting. Is Hitler a unique figure? Is Stalin a unique figure? Or is this sort of context in which the figures rose conducive to a character, whether it was this person or the next, it was going to happen at one point or another. But I've had history professors who have said, guys, it's not falsifiable. We'll never know, but it's still, we can't resist discussing it. So, Robin, how did this topic leave you when you read it?
Well, I think it's one of these things where I didn't realize until I read the notes for this podcast that this was the big beef with this book, because I actually came away with a sort of different impression. I sort of felt like, obviously he journalistically put this in there. So, Alex, just to be upfront, I remember very little of the events in this book. All I remember is that there's a ton of people called Vons who are in charge at the start of the book, and they're up against the non-Vons, and the non-Vons, who are sort of like Hitler and Goebbels and everything, just beat the Vons, and von Stauffenberg and von Papen and all these other people are just sort of like, oh, we'll use them for our purposes. Other than that, there are two or three things that I really remember. One is one fact about Mein Kampf, which we can discuss. But the other is this really cool image he puts in your head where you could get, I think, Toby jugs or some kind of postcard that people would keep on giving to him, which were Martin Luther, Otto von Bismarck, and Hitler. And he just said that
the three names I mentioned incidentally.
Yeah. And then there's some phrase that people keep on repeating to it, which is like, one person set it up, another person consolidated, and now the soldier has to kind of execute it, right? So he was giving me that thesis in a really journalistic kind of nonfiction way. But I sort of felt that, like, morally, because this is a day-by-day, week-by-week kind of book, you do get the sense that maybe he's making the case that everyone had a choice. And there's one other really weird detail that I remember, which is that he gives this wonderful sort of eulogy to the Weimar Constitution. And he goes, this is the most beautiful sort of democratic document sort of ever written. And you can't tell if he's being sarcastic or not.
Potentially.
But he's sort of basically, to my mind, not necessarily saying all that happened was there was always going to be a Hitler. For me as a reader, just reading it, the impression I more got was like, oh my, this is what it's like when this kind of shit happens.
Yeah.
And everyone sort of has choices. And choice by choice, one side keeps on making the wrong one. And you keep on biting your lip every 2 pages. There's another really weird moment that I remember, and it stuck with me, which is that Roosevelt has basically just made a speech saying, like, hey, we all need to disarm. And everyone goes, how crazy that he's saying this just as Hitler has become chancellor. So then Hitler now gives his big speech, and he goes, Germany will totally disarm. We're so on board with this. And so everyone goes, whoa, Hitler's on board, like, that's amazing. We really are going to have peace. But then the little small print he puts in there is like, so long as we get respect and so long as we're granted equal status with other nations. And within a few months, he said, no, you're not respecting us. We can't possibly agree to these terms. This League of Nations agreement is just nonsense. It's not respectful for who we are in Germany. We're not going to do what the Poles are telling us. This is outrageous. This is so offensive to us. We asked for just a little modicum of respect. So you know what? We're going to rearm. Screw you. We were so excited about disarming. And just as a person who thinks a lot about communications, I just sort of feel that's so outrageous, but also kind of brilliant.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to face saving, and perhaps it would be impossible to secure actual disarmament.
There's another sort of weird moment that I sort of remember. Because like 95% of the prisoners in Dachau voted yes to this, which is a real Hitler measure.
Yeah.
Look, you can basically say, yeah, they were prisoners, they did it, they were under pressure, but they had nothing to lose.
They thought it was important
already.
They thought it was important to be seen voting, correctly.
And on this particular measure, they were like, yeah, like go for it, like German rights. So I think whether it's Sonderweg, and I'd love your opinion about this because, we mentioned Russia already. As someone who, look, I always think it's awful when people say as a student of history at the start of any sentence. It's always, whatever the payoff is going to be after that, it's going to be a really irritating insight.
No.
But I will say...
Are you going to say it, though?
I'm going to say I study history mostly for aesthetic reasons. I just want to know how other people thought and think for the same reason that there is no counterfactual, so you have to accept that. But that said, I'd never heard of this Sonderweg. Not sure if... I mean, the German state, was it even inevitable to begin with? I don't know if you want to take the longue durée. How much of it is on Hitler? I sort of feel like Shirer is also basically saying, if you meet a German who said, hey, we were always against Hitler, be very skeptical of that person.
Yes, but I think at the same time, and I did have one little quote that I think sums up the thesis, but I do think that, as you say, the book is more complicated than simply saying it was predestined to land this way. I think that's a good reason to be a little skeptical of the summaries of the book because it is far more than just this Sonderweg thesis. But here's a quote. The paralysis of the mind and the will of grown-up men, supposedly disciplined in the old virtues, boasting of their code of honor, courageous in the face of death, is astonishing, though perhaps it can be grasped if one remembers the course of German history outlined in an earlier chapter, which made blind obedience to temporal rulers the highest virtue of Germanic man and put a premium on servility. So you have to wait until page 1081 to get to that.
Well done, Alex. This was just a quick skim.
It was a slog. But, so that does sound a little bit like, inevitability. I think zooming out, it's very hard to, and this is, sympathy here. It's very hard for anyone in a position of totalitarian society to, stand up in the face of, obliteration. I think I'm very, very skeptical of predetermination for sort of national paths. I think it's just a bit of a simplistic trope. I think we're, as humans, we're inclined to try and find patterns and predict outcomes in a way that's simply not realistic. So I think in hindsight, you can draw a line between, influential national thinkers and political leaders, but whether looking forward, you could ever predict,
I mean, I think that's totally right. And I think another thing about the book, which I don't think historians quite nail, but one of the things that makes it so compelling is that he was a correspondent. He had been living there. And I think he had basically been saying, hey, these guys are really, really bad. They really mean what they say. I'm here. I'm looking at it. I'm meeting these people. These people are really going to go for it. Like, trust me on this. Trust me on this.
Indeed.
I imagine him having this amazing sort of crackly CBS voice being like, "Hello for Berlin, where today the Führer lined up." So it's not like he has a medium to do it. But I think one of the things that makes this, as a literary artifact, really interesting is that quite often he will do these very dry notes where he's quoting from Goebbels' diary. He's quoting von Stauffenberg saying this. He's quoting from this person. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he'll be like, "And at this time, people in Germany would come up to me and say this. And if you were going into any restaurant at the time, then you would encounter this kind of a personality or a type." And I was actually at that rally. And what I saw, from the back was this. And I'm not going to read Churchill's account of the Second World War. It just seems like really redundant in a way that this isn't. And that's a puzzling thing to say. But I think it's more like Thucydides, where in his history of the Peloponnesian War, he bursts out of nowhere and just goes, "Hey, I was there in the plague.
I saw that.
We went nuts during the plague. We were, it's like COVID now, we all went insane. We were all looking out for just ourselves and all of our bonds went out of it." And then he goes back, "Pericles did this and then the Spartans did that." And then, says that, yes, and then there was a guy called Thucydides who did a campaign and it didn't go so well, and that was me. But, I do think you don't encounter that so much. And I think that's one of the things that makes this so readable now, because as a literary artifact, it's one part memoir and one part just that generation just trying to figure out what on earth just happened. Not sort of like, why did it happen, but like, how could something like this happen? So I think I think Alan Bullock is one of his sort of enemies. And I guess Ian Kershaw, basically everyone who studied this he's wrong.
Yeah, and he does. I like how he sort of asks a question at the beginning. He says, should I have waited, or should historians have waited a few more decades before this book was written? And I think that's a different purpose. And I think that, you should read something published 60, 70 years later when the archives are settled. And you should also read the firsthand "and I was there" account, because you need to compare these two things to get a closer sense of what actually was going down.
I think that's actually it. I think it's more of a primary source than a secondary source in the end.
Yeah, good point.
And I think that's what makes it so alive. And that's what makes it so emotional. It is a crazy comment for him to say Hitler was one of the great adventurers like Napoleon. I think because in our mind, Hitler has become such a devil-like figure. To put him on the same plane as Napoleon and Alexander, I mean, your namesake, you must be very offended by that.
Well, but but it's interesting because due to recency, I'm sure in significant degree, I think Hitler was anachronistic. I mean, he was on a level of brutality that we hadn't seen for, centuries before.
And I think that's one of the weird things that I also think has changed a little bit, is that exactly like that Ron Rosenbaum thing, every question about Hitler is why is he so evil? What is evil? But I grew up watching Second World War movies on TV all the time, which I think sort of Americans didn't do so much. I don't know why that is, but Where Eagles Dare and all these sort of things and The Great Escape, it's basically assumed that you're going to have a German general who's not that bad. And the SS people are awful. And the basic tone of most Second World War movies is not that the Nazis are the most evil people on the planet. It's like, this is an epic war. And on the one side, there are perfectly good generals, and on the other side there are perfectly good generals, and this is the way it has always been, and this is just one in a series of cataclysmic wars. And I think that Shirer quote is sort of shocking in the sense that it's almost like he's nostalgic. He's basically saying this is the last time anyone in history will ever be able to do something like this, because the nuclear bomb exists. And I think that's really an odd point of view, but very appropriate to its time.
Yep. And I do think, the presence of nuclear weapons is clearly a game changer, to put it mildly. But we still see a lot of adventurism in the decades that followed the Second World War in ways that Shirer may not have.
Well, this
predicted.
is it. So now Ukraine's being invaded. You're a bit of a Slavophile. You love your Russia. Reading about this book, thinking about it, just seems like Russia is always going to be autocratic. If I was to be totally ignorant,
Eastern promises. Yeah.
It just seems like there can be
No.
Is there not something in Russia where it's always going to be autocratic, Alex?
No way. I think things can move in positive directions. things can move in negative directions. I think we cannot allow, this is my big, political manifesto at the end of the episode. We cannot allow for, these topics of inevitability to be assumed.
What Russian history should I read to convince myself of your thesis that
there's
there
not
is
a great
democratic
deal.
Russia
There's not a great deal
inside this?
It's not a great deal of optimistic histories. I would say a couple things. Between Two Fires, Joshua Yaffa. It's a pretty new book, but the format is excellent. It's basically individual stories in contemporary Russia, some uplifting, others less so. Alexander Herzen. I feel like you've probably read Alexander Herzen at some point, but he was such an interesting character in 19th century Russia. Went out among the people to learn more about his countrymen. He was an elite of the elites.
Have you read or watched The Coast of Utopia?
No.
Tom Stoppard trilogy of plays, all about political exiles. Herzen is a big character.
Yeah. Well, the Decembrists, which were contemporaries of Herzen, were 200 years ago. They inspired the Bolsheviks 90 years after they came. But there have been movements. It's just a question of whether they catch fire or not.
Well, wouldn't the counterfactual be that there's a long history of liberals and a long history of really engaging thinkers who in other countries their ideas have been adopted and the saplings that they've handed out in books have been put into other soil and just grown terrifically? But in the steppes of Russia just seem to just wither and die.
But Robin, I think one of the themes we're going to come back to is the longue durée. We got to zoom way out. I think we're on too small a time scale to really come to any conclusions.
Okay, so you're predicting that by 3000, this is your big bet on Polymarket. You're placing a bet 3,000 years from now.
Exactly, and we'll be speaking about how Russia has always been liberal democracy. There is a fun book called Why the West Rules for Now, and it basically is this comparative of the West and China. Very, very simplistic framing, but a smart Stanford guy who looks at China in the early 19th century was pretty darn strong relative to the West, and so we got to zoom out. So listeners, we've prevaricated, we've left the topic, we've come back to it. Robin, do you want to give a shelf rating -10 to +10?
I think on the shelf, you've got to be very careful with a book like this, because anytime you're reading Second World War history, you're instantly under suspicion. You just are. You're just. I think of that Succession character who's really into history, but really is just into Nazis.
Red flag.
Tom is just basically being like, well, what is it that attracts you to the Second World War so much? And he's like, just the horrible waste of human life. All these Americans, all these Germans, all these Poles. He's like, is there anyone else you want to mention? Add to that tally? He's like,
that pretty much covers it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I feel like it's a tough one. So I think I just have to almost inoculate it on the shelf to just make sure that it's right next to, I don't know how to put it, but like not woke. Exactly. I think that's even worse. I just held up a book called Everyday Stalinism, which is the sequel to Stalinism for Life, Happiness, Marriage, and also the sequel of Rich Stalinist, Poor Stalinist. And it's just how Stalinist makes you everything better. Dad.
Vital. Yeah.
I think I would put it next to, I would put it next to sort of 16th century, 17th century history, just to show that I am interested in the longue durée. I put in some English Civil
maybe
War
a book about
books,
Luther.
French
Luther
Revolution.
himself. Yeah. Spinoza, Luther. Yeah.
And so I'd put poetry on one side, and I'd put I'd put like 19th century sort of like novels on one side, and then history on the other, just so that it's kind of like I'm interested in so many other things than this.
You need to make sure you're hedged here. You don't want to look like crazy.
I don't want anyone at my party to be looking at my shelf being like, so Robin, you're into Hitler?
No.
Oh, you're into the Third Reich? It's not going to be exciting.
And put the, explaining Hitler Rosenbaum book in a completely different section, maybe in your pop psychology section or something like that.
But I will say, I think this book has a big fan set. So I was listening to the Conan O'Brien podcast, and episode 9, he's actually talking about what he wants the podcast to be. And he says something like, look, on TV, it's impossible to have a proper conversation. It's not like I can just go around being like, oh, have you read William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich? And I was like, Conan O'Brien is one of the club. So
he's a Harvard man at the end of the day.
I think in terms of performative reading, you can't do it in a cafe.
No.
It's just not a good look. I remember I once gave my friend Ian Kershaw's biography of Hitler on the subway. And he was like, thanks, but no thanks. When I was like, hey, how's that book? He's like, it's a great book. But anytime I'm reading Hitler,
I thought you were saying you gave your friend Ian Kershaw a book on the subway.
No. I gave my friend John Wayland Ian Kershaw's Hitler. And John was saying, thanks, Robin. Now I'm getting dirty looks on the subway. So I'm just going to read this book outside of Conan O'Brien's office because I think he's desperate to talk about it as much as I am.
Clearly.
And if I was just there, he would cross the road. And we just have like a little talk.
My version of this is the Taliban Reader, which is the collected publications.
Oh, you like it as well?
Yeah. You're into this?
Wow. A lot of people think it's just about chopping off people's heads and destroying Buddha statues, but no.
Turns out it is.
Okay.
Robin, do you want to read the rest of this book, the remaining 70%?
I'll tell you what. This is a book that I think will always be there for me. And it's a book that like I definitely put down with the intention of picking up again. And when I need Lexapro and the Shirer, it'll come back and it will put me to bed just fine. And it'll really help me along.
So that's a yes.
That's a yes. There's no question. I'm not sure I'll ever get to 100%. Who knows? Maybe I'll even get to some of the war.
Now that is an exciting note for our listeners.
This list right now. Okay.
There's a lot there.
Okay. Look, we've done Capital, which sounds Marxist, and then we've done The Fall and the Third Reich, which sounds fascist. So we can't do another sort of book on the 20th century's signal battle of economics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to pick a book title that I literally don't know what it's about, but I know you haven't finished it.
Oh,
I'm just going to pray it's not about either fascists or communists. But
let's see.
Actually, even just saying this, I'm really worried that actually that's exactly what it is because I might have just described it. And that book is Between Two Millstones.
Our listeners are going to die. This is volume 1 of the Solzhenitsyn memoir, but we can't go back.
So this is like the Gulag Archipelago? What is
This is, I mean, he had some interesting thoughts, let's put it that way. So this is sort of what he was writing while he was writing the Gulag Archipelago.
Wow. So we're going to go, so we have failed to escape our non-fiction obsessions. Okay, so here we go. Solzhenitsyn, better known as the great describer of anti-Stalinism, Gulag Archipelago, super pumped.
Yeah, I thought that the first things you were saying were excellent, but the second half, head scratcher.
Well, that's exciting.
Folks are going to love it. It's a great book for the bookshelf. My mother will be thrilled because she got it for me for a birthday a number of years ago. So it's getting the attention.
She knows you. Your mother. That kind of a gift. I know what Alexander needs. He needs a Solzhenitsyn deep cut. And no one else is going to get it for him.
She was right in a way that we didn't appreciate until this very moment, Robin. So we're all looking forward to it.
All right, folks, it's been such a pleasure discussing this. Thanks for this, Alex, and thank you for kicking off our second episode. I am pumped to remember William Shirer is a part of my life, actually. Those 2 paragraphs you read, just huge reminder of how much he's just a baller writer, just a flat-out great, entertaining writer. And I feel like Solzhenitsyn is going to have some pretty wild paragraphs as well.
No doubt about it, Robin.
What are the millstones? Do we know? Is there a prelude?
No, we're going to find out.
Excellent.
Until next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See ya.